Welcome to the Sober Addict Podcast. I'm your host, Zachary Dolce. This podcast is about the fight nobody sees, the thoughts you don't post, the battles that don't look dramatic but feel heavy. If you're sober, trying to get sober, or just tired of fighting your own mind, you're in the right place. Take a breath. You don't have to be strong here. One of the hardest questions recovery forces you to answer isn't how do I stay sober? It's who am I without the addiction? Because addiction doesn't just become something you do. It becomes something you organize your life around. It shapes your routines, your relationships, your personality, and even the way you see yourself. And when you take that away, you don't automatically step into clarity. You step into uncertainty. This episode is about that space. The identity gap that shows up when the addiction is gone, but your sense of self hasn't fully rebuilt yet. The feeling of not recognizing yourself, not knowing what fits anymore, and wondering who you're supposed to be now that survival mode isn't running the show. Recovery doesn't just ask you to stop using, it asks you to rebuild an identity from the ground up. And nobody really prepares you for how uncomfortable that can be. Right? I mean, addiction doesn't start out as an identity, but over time it quietly takes that role. Not because you chose it, but because it's filled with every space where something else might have been forming. It dictated how you spent your time, how you coped with stress, how you connected with people, and even how you understood yourself when things got hard. It gave you a certain role to play, even if that role was destructive. And roles provide structure in a way chaos alone never does. For a long time, addiction answered questions for you, like, who am I? I'm the one who uses. I'm the one who escapes. Maybe I'm the one who can't handle life without something taking the edge off. Those answers weren't healthy, but they were clear. And clarity, even when it's painful, can feel grounding. In active addiction, your days were organized around obtaining, using, recovering, and repeating. And it's all a cycle. That cycle created a sense of purpose, however destructive it was. You always knew that what came next. You always knew what your role was. So when you remove the substance in recovery, you don't just lose a coping mechanism. You lose the structure that organized your sense of self. And then suddenly there's no script. You wake up sober, but unsure of who you're supposed to be that day. The routines that once defined you are gone, and the version of yourself that knew how to navigate chaos doesn't have clear instructions anymore. This is where many people in recovery feel disoriented, even when they're doing everything right. You might notice that without the addiction, parts of your personality feel muted or undefined. You're not as reckless, not as intense. You're not as driven by impulse, and while those changes are healthy, they can also feel like loss. Because even destructive identities feel familiar. Addiction gave you a story, and stories make sense of pain. They explain behavior. They provide context. Without that story, you're left with unanswered questions about who you are and what actually fits. This is extremely difficult because recovery removes the extremes that once defined you. You no longer operate in crisis mode, but you're also not yet grounded in something stable enough to replace it. So now you're left in between. Not the person you were, and not yet the person you're becoming. That in between space can feel empty, and emptiness is something addiction once filled immediately. In recovery, you're asked to sit with it instead, and that can feel unsettling even when you know sobriety is the right path. This is why people in recovery sometimes say that they feel lost, bored, or unsure of themselves, not because recovery is failing, but because identity is rebuilding slowly rather than arriving all at once. Addiction didn't just numb pain, it defined you. And recovery doesn't hand you a new identity, it makes you build a new one. That process takes a long time, a lot of experimenting, and willingness to exist without clear labels. And for many people, that's one of the most uncomfortable parts of getting sober. You're not broken for feeling this way. You're not going backward. You're not stranding yourself on an island. And you're not standing in the beginning of something that hasn't taken shape yet. Uncertainty is part of that process, even when progress is happening beneath the surface. One of the things recovery rarely prepares you for is grief. Not just grief for what addiction took from you, but grief for the version of yourself that existed inside it. Even if that version was hurting, unstable, or destructive, that can feel confusing to admit. Because on the surface, addiction caused damage. It created consequences. It cost you time. It cost you relationships, opportunities, and your self-peace. So it doesn't make sense to miss any part of it. But grief isn't logical, and recovery doesn't erase attachment overnight. The version of you that existed in addiction may have been reckless, it may have been impulsive or guarded, but it was also familiar. It knew how to function in chaos. It knew how to survive pain quickly. It knew how to avoid vulnerability by staying numb or being distracted. Letting go of that version means letting go of the way you were being that once felt necessary. And even when you know sobriety is saving your life, part of you can still mourn the loss of something that gave you that identity or a sense of belonging, especially in addiction. Especially in those spaces where you felt that connection. This grief doesn't always show up as sadness. Sometimes it shows up as emptiness. Sometimes as nostalgia. Sometimes as irritation or restlessness or the sense that something is missing even when life is objectively better. You might catch yourself romanticizing parts of the past, not the pain, but the intensity, the certainty, or the way everything revolved around one clear focus. Addiction simplified things in a dangerous way, but it did make your world feel defined. Recovery removes that definition and replaces it with responsibility, choice, and uncertainty. You're no longer reacting to life, you're required to participate in it. And participation means making decisions without the shield of addiction, which can feel exposing when you're still learning who you are underneath everything you used to numb. This is where grief becomes complicated. You're not grieving the substance, you're grieving the version of yourself that knew exactly how to survive without feeling. And that grief can coexist with gratitude for sobriety, even though it feels contradictory. You can be thankful you're alive and still feel unsettled by who you're becoming. Recovery doesn't ask you to pretend that identity never mattered. It asks you to acknowledge that it did, without letting it define your future. It's a very delicate balance. If you ignore the grief, it often shows up sideways as frustration or the urge to retreat into old patterns of thinking, even if you don't act on them. If you name it, it becomes something you can move through rather than something that quietly controls you. Grieving the old version of yourself doesn't mean you want it back. It means you're human. It means you're honoring the reality that addiction shaped you, even if you're choosing not to let it own you anymore. And understanding that grief is a crucial step in recovery, because you can't fully step into who you're becoming until you allow yourself to acknowledge who you had to be to survive. After the addiction identity loosens and the grief starts to surface, there's another layer that shows up in recovery that doesn't get talked about enough: fear. Not fear of relapse, but of the unknown version of yourself that hasn't fully formed yet. Addiction, for all its destruction, made things predictable. You knew how you would respond to pain. You knew exactly how you would cope with the stress. And you knew how to escape when things felt overwhelming. There was a certainty in that pattern, even when it was killing you. Again, recovery removes that certainty. Now you're sober, present, and responsible for your choices in a way that you weren't before. And that responsibility can feel heavier than the addiction ever did, because there's no longer something external to blame when things just feel uncomfortable. You might notice yourself hesitating more, second-guessing decisions, or feeling unsure about what you actually want, not because you've lost capability, but because you're no longer operating from reflex alone. This can create a quiet fear. And you start asking yourselves, like, what if I don't like who I become? What if I'm boring? Or what if I can't handle life without the edge I used to have? Those questions aren't signs of weakness. I used to ask myself those questions all the time. They're signs that you're stepping into autonomy for the first time in a long time. Addiction gave you a ready-made identity. Recovery gives you a choice. And that choice can be terrifying when you're used to survival. There's also the fear of visibility, right? I mean, when you're no longer hiding behind the addiction, people see you more clearly. Your reactions, your boundaries, your mistakes, they're all yours now, and that can feel exposing when you're still learning how to trust yourself. Some people in recovery would rather cling to the discomfort of the old identity than risk the uncertainty of a new one, because at least the old version was known, even if it was painful. This is where recovery can stall a little bit, not because you want to go back, but because moving forward requires tolerating uncertainty without immediate answers. You're not failing because you don't know who you are yet. You're not behind because you feel unsure. You're in the process of building something that isn't based on escape. And that takes a long time. Fear in this stage isn't a warning sign. It's more of a byproduct of growth, let's say. It shows up when old coping mechanisms are gone and new ones are still forming. And learning to move forward anyway, without rushing to define yourself, is one of the most courageous parts of recovery, even if it doesn't feel dramatic or strong in the moment. Recovery doesn't give you a new identity all at once. It doesn't. It gives you space. And space can feel uncomfortable when you're used to something constantly filling it. That space is where your new identity starts to form. Not through dramatic reinvention, but through small, repeated choices made without the option of escape. Choices about how you respond when things are hard, or how you sit with the uncertainty. How you show up when you don't know exactly who you are yet. This is the part of recovery that feels slow and undefined because there's no clear milestone that says you've arrived. Identity rebuilds quietly through consistency rather than intensity, and that can feel anticlimactic after years of living in the extremes. You begin to notice what actually fits when you're not numbing discomfort or chasing relief. What feels sustainable, what drains you, what grounds you. And those observations matter more than any label ever could. You don't become someone new overnight. You become someone honest. Honest about your limits. Honest about your needs. Honest about what you can and can't carry anymore. That honesty slowly replaces the identity addiction once held. Not because you forced it to, but because it's no longer has to compete with the escape. There will definitely be days when you miss the certainty addiction gave you. Days when you wish things felt more defined or dramatic. Days when being sober feels quiet in a way that's hard to describe. Those days don't mean you're failing. They mean you're living without anesthesia. And living without anesthesia takes courage, especially when you're still learning who you are under everything you used to avoid. You don't need to have your identity figured out to stay sober. You don't need a clear sense of purpose, confidence, or direction to keep going. You just need to stay present long enough for your real self to take shape. That self will be steadier than the one addiction gave you, quieter, less reactive, more durable, and it will grow not from survival but from choice. If you're listening to this and you feel lost in recovery, unsure of who you are now that the addiction is gone, just understand this. Feeling undefined doesn't mean you're empty. It means you're rebuilding without shortcuts. You don't need to win today. You just can't quit today. I'm still fighting. And if you're listening to this, I hope you are too. Keep fighting. I'll talk to you next time.